So I'll switch to talk a little bit about, tolerance to waterlogging. We do know that waterlogging is one of the major effects of climate change. Some of you have seen recently in the news floods that have affected Eastern Africa, which is quite unusual. But, when you have floods, you might also end up having waterlogging for long periods of time. Most crops are not able to tolerate waterlogging, but we know, for example, on this screen, we see that, finger millet, this millet as well, called Job's tears and banyan millet, were actually tested for tolerance to waterlogging. And you see in finger millet, for example, it ends up having even more leaf area under waterlogged soils that ends up contributing to yield in comparison to, common millet or palm millet or foxtail millet. These are traits that are really, really unique. And so we can capture that and use it in our breeding programs to enhance not just finger millet, but other crops as well. This study here by Matsura is just showing the growth rate of some millets under waterlogging. And you can see in some of them where I highlight here, the growth rate is it's quite good. So it just shows the potential of how we can utilize some of these underutilized species in our breeding programs. Finger millet is also known to tolerate salinity, and this is just a small comparison that was done in the lab. And I have to put a disclaimer here that these were just randomly picked finger millet genotypes. And also the comparison was done with rice. And as you can see, finger millet is still thriving in the plate at 300 millimolar, while rice couldn't make it beyond 100, and this was one of the most tolerant, salinity tolerant rice known. Now, finger millet and rice are really closely related, and it's really possible to overexpress genes from finger millet into rice to enhance tolerance. And so these are things that can be easily exploited to enhance quality of mainstreamed crop varieties. Again, for palm millet, in response to salinity, these were studies that were done really like several years ago, but still quite relevant, because most of these genotypes have not really been exploited, especially under African conditions, to be able to enhance the tolerance to salinity of palm millet, for example. A crop such as pigeon pea, we do know that pigeon pea, as well as so many other underutilized legumes, that they improve soil health. Pigeon pea can fix more than 100 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. So by the way, the optimum nitrogen required for sorghum production is about 108 kilograms per hectare. So if you can intercrop sorghum with pigeon pea that ends up fixing more than 100 kilograms per hectare, you already have all the nitrogen you need for optimum growth of that crop. So it's almost like nature has given us all these solutions that we can exploit. And I think most of the times we haven't really exploited them well. Most farmers in Africa cannot afford fertilizer, but are they even aware that if they were to intercrop with pigeon pea, that they would have most of all the nitrogen that they need? But even if they were aware that pigeon pea would do that, do they know the differences between different genotypes so that they can use that genotype that gives them the optimum nitrogen fixation? Yeah, so those are some of the things that we really need to communicate to the farmers as scientists who are working on this crop. We also know that pigeon pea can remobilize leaf nitrogen. So when you grow it and then you use it as leaf, as green manure, it can remobilize again the nitrogen that was on the leaf back into the soil. And it can do that up to 50 kilograms per hectare. So you can almost have like a sustainable and clean ecosystem, just managing with some of these underutilized crops if you select well and if you have the right information. Now, something else that's really unique about pigeon pea is that it produces a certain exudate that enhances phosphorus availability in the soil. Now, phosphorus is one of the most limiting nutrients, especially for legume production. But what pigeon pea does is that because it has such a deep root system, and also because it produces this exudate, it's able to bring up phosphorus, especially those that are in very low, deep soil, in the deeper parts of the soil, bring it to the surface and make it available to other crops. So this can be an accompanying crop or a rotational crop. But also, pigeon pea is one of those crops that is able to nodulate without inoculation. So you just need to study it and be able to identify the right one and recommend it to the farmers and have all the nitrogen that you need for the production of your cereals. And we do know that, you know, most farmers are not really able to produce fertilizer. And by the way, in some cases, even when they can afford the fertilizer, most of the time they are at the mercy of middlemen who sometimes even adulterate the fertilizer they give them. So the farmers might end up paying so much and get just something else, not fertilizer, really. I mean, for those of you who may be aware that we had a recent scandal in Kenya where, you know, farmers were sold really adulterated. It was actually not fertilizer at all. So why not just spend time and use crops that are available within your locality if they would have that? Anyway, so I'll make a quick switch and talk about reduction of greenhouse gases. And one of the traits that I've just learned in the last 2 years and I'm quite excited about is this trait called biological nitrification inhibition. And the crop in focus that I'll talk about is sorghum. So nitrification, so this trait, and I'll abbreviate it as BNI, it's the natural ability of especially cereals to enhance the uptake or the availability of nitrogen in the soil. So we do know that when you apply nitrogen or when all these legumes fix nitrogen, it is prone to leaching, which goes to underground water and contaminates water, which is a huge problem in terms of diseases also to humans. But we also know that that nitrogen can be converted into greenhouse gases. And these greenhouse gases are nitrous oxide or N2O, which is quite serious in terms of global warming. You know, N2O can stay in the atmosphere for up to 100 years or more. And so it is quite destructive to the environment. So we know that when we apply nitrogen, synthetic nitrogen, only 30 to 40% of that is used by plants. However, this ability of certain cereals to utilize available nitrogen in the soil, which is called BNI, enhances the availability of the nitrogen. So it will reduce the nitrification, which happens in the soil through the microorganisms in the soil. And in the example of sorghum, sorghum produces a specific compound called sorgoleone. Now, this sorgoleone has nitrification inhibition capacity, and it will reduce the activity of the bacteria in converting this nitrogen into forms that will be easily leached or produced as greenhouse gases. Now, this trait is very relevant because now we know, after studying, we know that it's not available in any sorghum. You don't go to any sorghum you pick and you find, oh, it will produce high levels of sorghum. The quantity or the production level varies across different genotypes. But we do know that crops or sorghum genotypes that have been grown under low nitrogen produce it more. And that's because it's their inherent ability to make sure that the little nitrogen that's available is used up. So it's a trait that is really important because it's relevant both in intensive production systems, but also in low input mixed cropping systems. You know, in intensive production systems, we've gotten into this habit of just applying more and more and more and more nitrogen into the soil, nitrogen fertilizer into the soil. And we know that only 30 to 40% of it is being utilized. But it's even become a political thing that, you know, politicians now use it to say, oh, we're going to subsidize. And so farmers just keep on adding and adding and adding a nitrogen fertilizer in the soil. Now that ends up creating such a huge contamination problem and ends up causing diseases. In fact, the presence of nitrates in water that we drink has been shown to contribute to most of, you know, like the cancer-related or heart-related diseases. Now, if we can reduce that by producing sorghum that has this inherent ability to utilize the little bit of sorghum of nitrogen that's in the soil, we will have resolved that problem. But at the same time, we'll have reduced the release of nitrous oxide into the atmosphere. But also in low input mixed cropping systems that are typical of the African production systems where, you know, most farmers cannot afford inorganic fertilizer. So in most cases, they just use microdosing. So if you're able to have sorghum varieties that will utilize that little bit of fertilizer you've added for even 3-4 seasons, or that little bit of nitrogen that the accompanying crop like pigeon pea has added, then we end up with a very environment safe production system, but also very cost effective, but at the same time, very clean environment. And we now know that it's not just sorghum. Most of these underutilized millets have this trait. Finger millet, pearl millet, most of the perennial grasses have this trait. And so it's something that we can actually use to streamline or to enhance soil fertility, as well as reducing the greenhouse gas contamination. Now, I talked about enhancing capacity in molecular breeding. All these nice things that we've talked about will not be possible if we don't enhance capacity in molecular breeding. And I'm going to give an example of cassava. The reason I'm giving an example of cassava is because 10 years ago, 20 years ago, cassava was considered an underutilized crop. And that is not the case now because there has been a lot of investment in the crop and, you know, also a lot of research has been done. So it is not considered anymore an underutilized crop. And this is where we would really like most of what we're using now as underutilized crops to get to. And the example here is that cassava made it because there was a lot of capacity building for the African breeding programs that was quite focused on the national breeding programs. And the partnership was such that, you know, we had almost like a mentoring institution in the US that was always supporting these national programs. And so cassava has had such a huge success. So we have to enhance capacity in our breeding programs to ensure we come from a place where what we have, we are considering as an underutilized crop today is no longer an underutilized crop tomorrow. But at the same time, we need to share genomic resources. We need to get from where, you know, we're just generating resources and keeping it to ourselves and not sharing it. And I think that's one of the things that the cassava program did really, really well. And I'm talking specifically about the Next Gen Cassava program, where they built a community of practice, and when they generated data, they shared it, and they keep on doing that, but also they included the global community. And, I get surprised sometimes when I go to global meetings to see how people who've never seen cassava before are just so excited about this cassava because of the tremendous resources that are available to study it. Now, we obviously, especially if we're talking about the African context, we really do need to strengthen our national programs through capacity building for sure, but also just making sure that that capacity is sustained. Sometimes we have huge projects that are building our capacity, but if the government is not involved to ensure that whatever capacity is built within that project period is sustained, it ends up going to waste. And in some cases, we've had really huge investments that 10 years later, after the donor has moved, it's all gone to waste. And as I did mention, we need to build multidisciplinary community of experts. And that's one of the things that drove me into sharing this presentation, is because I do know that by doing this, we are expanding our networks. I'm connecting with you all who are working or doing something that is similar. And that community, we keep it vibrant in whatever way, maybe through the award platform or LinkedIn or different ways that we keep it vibrant so that, the new generation can see that these are things that are important for us to talk about. And obviously, as I did mention, we need political goodwill as well. We can't stop by saying we just need political goodwill, but we have to involve our politicians, our heads of state, whenever we are planning or whenever we get good results. We need to figure out how best to communicate our research results in a way that it will interest those who actually support or strengthen these systems for us. And just to summarize, we do know that there are several species of crops out there, and especially in Africa, we have so much, but somehow we are leaning towards neglecting them and eating other crops that have come from elsewhere, to the loss of this rich diversity that we have. So we do need to embrace the crops that we have. We need to characterize them. We need to understand that the climate resilience traits are not going to come from the sky. It will come from the local resources that we have. And so let's embrace them and research on them and, make people know about them, promote them, build capacity in any way, however small, and make sure that we raise awareness for these crops, especially with our politicians. Sorry, I think this took much longer than I thought, but thank you so much for listening. And I'm really looking forward to having a healthy discussion over the slides that I just presented. Thank you so much for listening.